Thank you, Glenda, for inviting me, and it's great to be here and to be part of to connect with the New Zealand Aotearoa composers community this year, and I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's speeches. This is going to be just read from paper, so sorry about that. It's just, the way it is. So since 1986, I've been living in the Netherlands, and although I've been visiting Aotearoa New Zealand regularly, this is only the second time in 30 years that I'm here for a longer period. That means there's lots of questions that may seem obvious to locals that I ask, and my apologies for possibly stating the blazingly self-evident. This talk is entitled Thoughts on the Intersection of Art and Politics, but maybe it should have also included life in the title, because I want to start with harvesting experiential knowledge to encourage sometimes hidden connections between art and politics and music making to reveal themselves. Secondly, as a cautionary tale, I'd like to briefly outline some of the issues that the Dutch art community have faced in the last decade. And finally, I want to talk about the situation in New Zealand Aotearoa. So we begin with the things that became clear to me as a child and young adult regarding class, communication practices, and various music scenes. Because my father was a Methodist minister with leftist politics, he was always placed in low socioeconomic suburbs. And because my parents were idealists, we went to the local schools, first in Brockville and Dunedin, then Hornby and Christchurch. By the way, several of my uncles were also leftist ministers of religion, so our holidays were spent in Porua and Otara. The first sense that playing classical music might be socially complicated was when I had to play violin for members of the local gang who weightlifted in our garage when I was 9. However, it was in Christchurch that the discrepancies became more pronounced. As an 11-year-old, I started playing in one of the CSA orchestras and discovered very quickly that not only did I live in the wrong neighbourhood, but I also went to the wrong school. Someone like me was not supposed to be playing classical music. Those of you who have lived in Christchurch will know this phenomena. We might think this classism was a local problem, but many years later, while I was working with the NZSO, the same attitudes were present. This time it manifested itself in reference, among other things, to hairstyles and dress codes for rehearsals. Did I not know that yellow and purple were incompatible? However, by that stage, I also had other perspectives on what belonging to a music ensemble might mean. While studying at Vic, I played in a wide variety of groups, including the Baroque Players, a contemporary string quartet, gamelan ensemble, various post-punk bands, and also experimented with free improvisation. Each of these ensembles had its own specific dynamic between maker and performer. It's a subject I'll talk about later, ranging from both roles being embodied in each member of the group in the case of the bands and the free jazz groups, to the strict separation of function in the symphonic orchestra situation. Furthermore, these ensembles had an array of performance and rehearsal practices. In the Baroque orchestra, there was space for discussion, albeit restricted. In the string quartet, it was a democratic process. Gamelan, there was very much a sense that every player was of equal value, whatever your musical function. Band rehearsals were often rather anarchic and disorganised, while at the other end of the spectrum there was the extreme hierarchy of the orchestra: composer, conductor, principal, rank and file. I remember subbing with the NZSO as a young, eager player and wanting to suggest a different bowing from the back of the second violins. I was told in no uncertain terms by the desk in front of me that the information flow was one-directional and that I should wait for the sectional leader to think of it, or not, as the case might be. If we consider the proper concern of art to be humanity, as Lilburn suggests, and furthermore that humanity does not exist in a physical vacuum, so that human problems are always being worked out in a particular context, it seems that it could be valuable as creative artists to be involved in considering the human context of music making. What kind of communication systems are at work? In his book Together, The Rituals, Pleasure and Politics of Cooperation, the sociologist Richard Sennett discusses two different sorts of communication, the dialectic and the dialogic. I really recommend that book, by the way. It's really interesting. The dialectic model he describes as a verbal play of opposites, gradually building up to a synthesis. The aim is to arrive at a common understanding. As Sennett states, skill in practicing dialectic lies in detecting what might establish that common ground. In the dialogic model, which is a word coined by Mikhail Bakhtin, a discussion does not resolve by finding common ground, Buckton uses this term to describe the process of exchange in which people may become more aware of their own views and expand their understanding of others without necessarily resolving an agreement, but which may well spark new ideas. Sennett suggested that both these skills are often present in the process of rehearsing chamber music and are ways of communication that may be useful in society as a whole. Our compositions do not exist in a vacuum. They come alive through human connections. Even pure electronic works require assistance from venues, sound engineers, and those of us that compose for performers are totally dependent on others to realise our compositions, to bring them to life. Some questions that come to mind. What kind of performance and rehearsal situations do our pieces require? Are these situations that we find satisfying? Do we see them as creative and artistic? Do we have any possibility to choose the kind of communications that occur? Can we use our position as composer to influence these situations if they are not satisfactory? And what is the relationship between the ideas in our works and the conditions of their rehearsal and performance? Of course, there are many other layers in which art is political. Another favourite bugbear of mine, which also stems from the different musical hats I've worn over the years, is the relationship between maker and performer. Some of you probably have heard me raving on about this, so my apologies if I'm repeating myself. We live in the tail end of an era in Western music in which the cult of the composer as genius and also as a separate entity from the performer has been widespread. However, in many cultures, and for most of our own Western history, this divide between makers and executors was not present. I'm aware of the artistic advantage that may arise from having compositional decision-making separate from the arena of the performers. Many of the composers that I most admire have written works that performers might consider non-musical or non-idiomatic for their instrument. Often these pieces involve non-standard performance practices relating to both or either the understanding of the function of music or relating to sound production of an instrument. Performers may feel uncomfortable, embarrassed, angry, and distrustful of this way of music making. I remember how antagonistic many of my fellow performance students in Den Haag were towards the works of Cage when the Conservatorium organised a festival dedicated to his works in his presence. The lack of vibrato, expressivity, and the presence of chance events in his pieces were all experienced by these students as anti-musical. If we as composers choose to push the boundaries of our performers, how do we ensure they feel safe, included, and respected in the process? On the other hand, having composed and performed in many new music ensembles, I also recognise that there are often situations in which the creative role of the performer is not acknowledged. One can think of the more extreme situations in which composers collaborate with the performer to create a work, but do not acknowledge the creative input from the musician. And even in a composition made without support from a performer, however precisely notated a work is, there are always micro-decisions that need to be made by the musicians that can dramatically influence the effectiveness of both the piece and the performance. In my view, there are moral and economic issues here that need addressing, and how we delineate creative versus executor functions. Maybe it's time to look at other alternatives. For instance, non-Western examples, co-creation, a consideration of our relationship with ownership. I've talked about the performer-maker relationship, and I'd like to briefly mention the third point in the triangle, the audience. I don't have time to discuss this at length, so I'll merely pose a few questions that come to mind. What is our relationship as composers with the audience? Do we have responsibilities to create audiences for our music? Are we happy with the situations in which our works are performed? How does our work exist in the world? And does our work need to be accessible? I'd like to now to talk a bit about arts and politics through a cautionary tale from the Netherlands, not because there's a direct parallel with New Zealand Aotearoa, but because there are, I believe, lessons to be learned. When I moved to the Netherlands in 1986, it was a walhalla, not only for new music, but for theatre and dance. Alongside the top-class orchestras, theatre groups and dance ensembles, there was a plethora of smaller ensembles. These ensembles did not exist alone, but were part of a complete infrastructure, a living ecosystem. Ensembles often had 4-year funding, venues were subsidised to include experimental programs in their planning, production houses were funded to help develop performances, there was funding for composers, choreographers and theatre makers to make work, and there was an informed audience that attended performances. Fast forward to October 2010, when The Guardian wrote, "A right-wing coalition is elected and arts cuts come while inevitably defence is protected. A nation sees its most precious cultural institutions dismantled. Artists and musicians take to the streets in protest. No, I'm not looking into my crystal ball. This is what is happening right now in the Netherlands. For years, a beacon of cultural excellence, especially in its support for new music. The arts budget there is facing a 24% cut, but as museums and libraries are to be protected from the worst of it, the performing arts, and particularly music, are facing devastation." In fact, after a second round of cuts in 2013, it reached 30%. In the last 8 years, with the help of a neoliberal government and under the guise of austerity measures due to the economic crisis, there have been dramatic slashes in the arts funding. Many large-scale companies, including several orchestras in the performing arts, were forced to disband, and the effect on the diverse small ensemble practice has been disastrous. Each part of the microcosm has been devastated by the neoliberal scythe. There are now only 2 new music ensembles that have structural funding. Others operate on a piecemeal basis, and the majority of ensembles have disappeared. Venues cannot afford to program any concerts that do not break even. There must be at least 2 guaranteed performances of a new work to even consider applying for a composition commission, and the criteria of the Arts Council is heavily weighted towards marketing concerns. And these cuts drive even deeper. The National Library of Theatre and the Music Information Centre have been disbanded. Their substantial collections are strewn across a number of different libraries. Gaudiamus, a beacon of light in the new music world community, has lost government funding and survives on a severely limited budget by the mercy of Utrecht City Council. STIME, a globally acknowledged centre for electroacoustic research, has had to move and is facing a very vulnerable future, and so on and so on. How could this happen? It's a question that has divided the arts community. One voice, often heard from those who are still receiving funding, suggests that there really was too much diversity, too many little groups, and it was time to have a clean-up. The fact that they are the survivors in this scorched earth landscape might have something to do with their reasoning. However, I believe it's a more complicated situation and one which we in Aotearoa New Zealand could learn from. The story includes intrigue, embittered civil servants who have held a long-term hatred of new music finally seeing their chance with a neoliberal government, neoliberal politics, a lack of unity, apathy, a changing of the guard, and a polemic vacuum. Let me talk a little about some of these aspects. The intrigue we'll leave to the imagination, which I'm sure can feed well on such a story. It's necessary to give a bit of a backstory to all this, even if it may not seem relevant to us in New Zealand Aotearoa. What was the situation that allowed this wealth of small ensembles to exist in the Netherlands? In the late 60s, there were large-scale student uprisings throughout the world. Amsterdam was no exception. Sit-ins at the university were commonplace. In this climate, it's not surprising that the artists were also politicised. 2 actions in particular need mentioning, both occurring in 1969. Action Tomato, Oxy Tomat, was instigated by theatre students protesting at the lack of social and political engagement by the established theatre groups. As the name suggested, it involved tomatoes being thrown at actors during what was seen as uninspired and old-fashioned performances. Smoke bombs were also used, and on one occasion a group of young actors infiltrated a performance as bit players and completely disrupted the performance. Serious, heated discussions followed and resulted in a theatre landscape from the mid-70s which allowed space for new experimental theatre companies. A similar movement was present in the music community. In the late 60s, a group of young composers, including Rambo de Leo, Peter Scott, Misha Mengelberg and Louis Andriessen, demanded that there be more space for new music within the symphony orchestra programming. Their most famous action was the Notenkrakers Actie, Nutcracker Action, in 1960, in which a group of activists with rattles and sirens noisily interrupted a concert by the Concertgebouw Orchestra, demanding an open discussion on music policy. This did not result in any improvement in the relationships with orchestras, but rather was the beginning of the tradition of small ensembles led often by composers, for which the Netherlands have been renowned. the Volharding, Hokatis, Martin Alton Ensemble, ICP, New Ensemble, Christiansen Septet, Ives Ensemble, and so on and on. That this occurred and was sustained for so many years is connected to a long Dutch tradition of ideological, religious, and sexual tolerance, which was also extended to the arts. For people who had no connection with the contemporary performing arts, there was a sense of, why not? What harm is it doing? Of course, the fact that the Netherlands is a rich country helps too. Another important factor was related to personal connections. Rainbow de Leeuw, composer, pianist, conductor, and champion of new music, was a great friend of Hans van Mierlo, who was for many years the leader of the Dutch left-leaning Liberal Party, D66. The power of a lobby in Parliament should not be underestimated. So what changed? The old guard, both politically and musically, has largely been replaced. The new generation of politicians, of any persuasion, have overwhelmingly no relationship with contemporary art music. They've grown up with pop and, due to a lack of music education in schools, have little feeling for what new music can mean. Secondly, politicians are pragmatists, as anyone who has watched the Danish political series Borgen understands. During my time on the executive board of the Netherlands Composers Union, before the last round of arts cuts in 2013, I personally presented the head of the Green Party with letters from eminent composers protesting at the moves planned, and was informed that they were making a deal with the government to allow the cuts to occur without protest in return for a continuation of foreign aid funding, which has consequently been slashed, by the way. Far be it from me to prioritise art over aid. However, it is important to realise that this polarisation of interests was something that was artificially created in order to make people feel there was no choice, as Naomi Klein describes in her book, The Shock Doctrine. There's always choice, and it seems to be important that we make sure arts funding is not the scapegoat. Thirdly, artists are notorious individualists. Many of us spend a lot of time trying to create a personal language. Unfortunately, this often leads to a lack of solidarity with our fellow artists. Although there were attempts at united protests in the Netherlands, the large art institutions often distanced themselves in a misguided attempt to escape the cutbacks. Finally, and maybe most importantly, this carnage could take place because of a lack of polemic. Unlike the French, who have a strong philosophical underpinning of the importance of the arts, the Dutch has allowed new music to flourish because there seemed no reason not to. With the rise of the neoliberals and the neoliberal polemic that saw art as a commodity, there was suddenly a powerful counterforce to the why not argument. Having sat on numerous advisory boards for the Dutch Arts Council in the last 6 years, I've seen how this neoliberal mindset has infiltrated decision-making within funding bodies. I understand New Zealand is a different story. It's never been well funded, and there has always been a focus on bums on seats. However, what I think the Dutch situation shows is, 1, it can always get worse, and 2, we need to arm ourselves with good argumentation as to why art and a diversity of artistic activities is necessary. How do we develop this? There are many paths from both within and outside the current system. I'd like to suggest several points of focus. In New Zealand Aotearoa, where there is an idea, largely erroneous in my humble opinion, that we are a green, environment-friendly country, a polemic that relates to ecosystems, sustainability and diversity with regards to the arts may find some resonance with politicians or decision-makers. Secondly, if we believe that art is the mirror of humanity, as Cicero suggests, we should ensure our mirror is a true reflection. How does our art practice as composer, educator, performer relate to New Zealand as a whole? I'd like to suggest that we ensure that our experience is enriched and informed by experiences of those with a different ethnicity, gender, age, sexual persuasion, and socio-economic status. This in relation to Lilburn's ideas on the importance of context. Art does not exist in a vacuum, and, I quote, our cultural problems need to be worked out in the context of these islands we live in. We need to understand what the context here is. In my year of New Zealand, I've been very aware of specific issues: the enormous housing crises, increasing inequality, environmental issues specifically concerning water, a propensity towards viewing incarceration as a solution. Serious issues in regard to relationships to Indigenous peoples, to different waves of immigrants, and to the environment, and a shamelessly short-sighted economic focus that prostitutes the resources of this country. I'm not suggesting we all need to make political art, although I feel there's a place for that, but rather that we need to acknowledge where we are, what is happening here, and respond as we see appropriate. Furthermore, having a considered position concerning our specific context enables us to communicate that clearly both to audiences and funding bodies. As the Dutch example shows, the importance of a political lobby should not be underestimated. It can be useful to ask each other who we know, who might be sympathetic to the arts, and how we can keep them informed and interested. In times of crises, these are the people we can turn to protect the interests of the arts. The neoliberal focus is always a financial one, which is not an easy bedfellow for contemporary art music. However, there are ways of showing the benefit of the arts in their language, the impact of so-called creative capital. In Amsterdam, artists have calculated how much the public coffers benefit by visitors and locals attending performances, festivals and exhibitions, not to mention the hotels, cafes that depend on the art lovers. This amount is far in excess of the arts funding that is received. In many countries in the world, a tourist tax is in place. Every night you stay in a hotel, you pay a small fee. In Cologne, a part of that tax is an art tax. Plans are afoot in other countries in Europe to channel some of the tourist tax directly back into the arts, as an awareness grows of the role art plays in tourism. Education is another essential focus, in my opinion. When I arrived in the Netherlands, I was astonished to attend new music concerts with a large, informed public. This was a generation that had grown up with classical music and had followed the various musical movements right through the 20th century. As this group becomes older, we need to address how we excite new generations for the music that we find so important. Education can take various forms. Music in schools is, of course, an extremely valuable resource. How can we influence the quality and quantity of the school programs? Can we influence new music ensembles to create programs for schools that include composers? I've been involved in a project set up by the Brodsky Quartet, in which a string quartet, a singer, 2 writers and 2 composers spend time in a high school making songs for voice and quartet with the pupils, resulting in a public performance which includes other string quartet works and a video for the pupils. There may be similar schemes in New Zealand. Financing such projects is always a stumbling block, but should not stop us attempting to improve the situation. Initiatives such as the Virtuoso Strings in Pororoa, which enables young musicians living in Pororoa to learn and borrow an instrument for free, are to be welcomed. A good friend of mine, one of the few Polynesian classical musicians in Wellington, told me how emotional it was to see a whole ensemble of brown faces performing, something he'd never experienced as a child. He also went on to recount the problems the organisation had getting a block booking for an NZSO concert, who did not offer them a discount and were very unwilling to let them attend. If we're being charitable, we could say that it was fear of a large group of school children being disruptive, but the shadow of racial and social discrimination is very present. In my opinion, this is where we as composers can voice our concerns to the orchestra. Another recent example from the same ensemble. I was lucky enough to be present at the 2017 New Zealand Composers Sessions in the Michael Fowler Centre a couple of weeks ago. Wonderful that the orchestra records all these pieces. However, I was absolutely flabbergasted that this concert was open to only a handful of people. When I asked someone why this was, they said the orchestra was worried the quality they were presenting was not of their usual calibre. I wondered whether they felt they had not chosen quality pieces, or whether they worried that the members of the orchestra would not perform at their best. Either scenario seemed to me highly problematic. Here is a concert dedicated to new New Zealand works, and hardly anyone is allowed to hear it live. Even from a purely neoliberal point of view, surely this is a seriously questionable use of resources. One has the whole orchestra in the Michael Fowler Centre. Even if you make it a free lunchtime concert, you're reaching a huge potential audience and promoting New Zealand music. The importance of connecting to the community at large should not be underestimated. I don't believe it's necessary to alter content to connect to a broader group, but one has to be aware of context and presentation. Possible points of intersection include pre- and post-concert talks, including some kind of participation, workshops at school or in the community, elements of participation in the performance itself. In our visually dominated environment, including some visual element can increase accessibility, which I have failed to do today, I'm sorry. Recently, I was involved in a multicultural community music theatre project in a predominantly Muslim community in West Amsterdam. Together with two directors, we worked with people from the community, aged between 4 and 94, to create a work that they performed on the street. We ran music and movement workshops from which both material for the live performance as well as recordings for the soundtrack were harvested. It was an extremely time-intensive process, but one which will have given many of the participants some insight as to what theatre and music can mean. Continuing on the community focus, it seems to me there are also questions we can ask as to how existing art institutions and music departments connect to their geographical community. In the Stuckist Manifesto from 1999, Billy Childish and Charles Thompson have several recommendations regarding art institutions. We demand that all college buildings be available for adult education and recreational use of the Indigenous population of the respective area. If a school or college is unable to offer benefits to the community it is guesting in, then it has no right to be tolerated. Whatever one thinks about this, it is necessary at least to have some vision on the relationship between an art school and its surroundings. Finally, I would like to briefly talk about the specific New Zealand situation, as I have experienced it. In the early 80s, conjunctly with my music making, I was heavily involved in political activism on a grassroots level. Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific, Pākehā women supporting Māori women, anti-apartheid movements, etc., etc. Hardly a week went by when we didn't organise some form of protest or fundraising activity. I experienced a real conflict between my post-colonial beliefs and my activities in the European art music tradition. One of the main reasons for moving to Europe was the sense of dislocation that participating within a New Zealand context in a tradition that I perceived as in essence European gave me. I'm heartened to see that there is development in acknowledging and embracing the specific cultural landscape of Aotearoa New Zealand. In my opinion, one of the great advantages of being an immigrant country is that one has a sense of creating culture rather than recreating, not being a slave to tradition. I'm excited about how New Zealand Aotearoa continues to develop her sense of self. Furthermore, if we talk about developing a polemic about the value of art, I believe that the role of the arts in Māori tonga can serve as a valuable model. Even from my very limited experience of Māori culture, it is apparent that the arts have a prominent role. Every good orator understands the power of mythology, storytelling, and song to strengthen an argument, or consider the abstract geometric patterns of the tukutuku, often related to a natural phenomena and connecting to a particular myth or wisdom. There seems to me a deep recognition that our understanding of the world is enriched by the poetic, that the language of logic is not the only form of communication. This is, in my opinion, powerful stuff, and we could do well to consider how our practice connects to this way of thinking. To summarise this rather rambling ponderings of mine, it is my understanding that art, like life, is always political. What is performed, by whom, where, how musicians rehearse, the relationship between performer, composer and audience, but also specifically what gets funded and the relationship between art and the political system, in our case neoliberalism, are all political and artistic issues. I would argue that whatever the colour of the political system we are in, we need a strong polemic supporting the value of the activity of music making that we hold so dear. Can we embrace the variety of music making present in this country while still embracing a sense of unity? This talk has more questions than answers, and I guess my final thought would be to encourage us to think, converse, share ideas, and continue to develop our understanding on what it means to compose in Aotearoa New Zealand now, in all its diversity. Thank you so much for lending me your ears.